You're listening to the Thoughts for a Living podcast, coming to you from the birthplace of the Civil Rights Movement, Montgomery, Alabama. Hello, and welcome to another episode of Thoughts for a Living. Today is May 29th, 2022. And we'd like to thank you again for taking time out of your day to join us here again at the Thoughts for a Living podcast. Today, we'd like to entitle this episode, Afraid to Remember. Afraid to Remember. An opinion article written by Cornel West in The Guardian stated, and I quote, "Trump is not out there with a gun, but he is leading a campaign, continuing what Malcolm X called a war against Black and colored people." For examples, West suggests we understand the racist white supremacist murders in 2015 of African Americans during a Bible study at Emmanuel African Methodist Episcopal Church in Charleston, the race-fueled killings of members of the American Asian community in Atlanta in 2021, of our Chicano brothers and sisters in El Paso, Texas in 2019, and Jewish Americans in Pittsburgh who worshiped at the Tree of Life Synagogue. Collectively, rather than looking at these incidents in isolation. He further states that these neo-fascist attacks reflect a histocultural continuation of the white supremacist founding of the U.S. Republic. This ungodly value system lay coiled not only around, in West's words, the legs of the table on which the Declaration of Independence and Constitution were signed, unquote, but was traumatically enculturated in a proverb among native peoples that white men speak with a forked tongue. Racism, white supremacy, communicated by its closeted allies as solely isolated acts perpetrated by lone wolves, bad cops, or mentally deranged individuals, attempts to de-emphasize systemic racism and institutional oppression in order to deflect any accountability of white Euro-Americans for demanding or prohibiting policies and laws that produce the practices, cultural norms, and institutional arrangements that both reflect and help to create and maintain race-based outcomes in society. This is also termed racialization from scholar John A. Powell. These conditions, my friends, have persisted historically and, sadly, are still a fact of American life. While racial framing, or in other words, white Eurocentric worldview, tries to hide the reality that whites, especially powerful whites, are the primary actors in the construction and maintenance of white racist societies. The current neo-fascists, which have for the past, say 50 years, hidden behind neoliberalistic privatization ideology promoted by neoconservative founder Leo Strauss and advocates including Bill Kristol, William Bennett, Newt Gingrich, Supreme Court Justice Antonin Scalia and Clarence Thomas, Jane Kirkpatrick, Paul Wolfowitz, Daniel Patrick Moynihan, and Milton Friedman, just to name a few, were given more camouflage, according to West, when President Biden and Vice President Harris both asserted just last year that America is not a racist country. West says these are lies, and lies, like all words, have real-world consequences. The cover that Biden and both conservative and liberal media outlets have tried to provide the national white psyche was blown up once again when a white supremacist fired into the bodies of black people buying groceries in Buffalo, New York. And to the Buffalo Massacre has been added the tragic murders of children and teachers engaged in learning at Robb Elementary School in Uvalde, Texas. Now, arriving just 4 minutes after the Latino American shooter, enforcers of the law, whom we are told ad nauseum are the first responders that run towards danger and save lives. Instead, these law enforcers police the parents of children who were under attack at that very moment, keeping them from attempting to do what law enforcers are paid to do. Because the power structure has always refused to acknowledge the institution of white supremacy, many people don't believe it exists. So says Barbara Smith in an article she wrote for the Boston Globe entitled, "The Problem is White Supremacy." Instead, though people of color are being massacred by white males, live in underfunded communities with poorly funded schools and reduced home property values, while we still pay taxes into a system that less than 60 years ago legally discriminated and segregated people of color from public services that they were paying for, and now you're trying to tell us that the issue is white folks being afraid of replacement? Why, for over 400 years, since the first European colonizers landed here in 1607 all the way up to today, people of color have been and continue to be exploited and oppressed. First, regarding Native peoples, this is their land. They lived here for thousands of years, never seeing a European face, having established various cultures across the North American continent. European colonizers came here uninvited and used lies and guns to take this land, killing and scalping Native men, women, and children. But when the indigenous people courageously tried to defend their families and their communities from murderous colonizers, they were called savages. I guess they didn't have a stand your ground law at that time. But after stealing Native people's land, white supremacists took Native children against their will to schools to try to make them hate themselves and their culture in order to make them adopt the white man's values, thinking, and religion. And now you tell us you are afraid? When it was you, your ancestors, who have tried to replace Native peoples, who were here thousands of years before any European whites appeared? Secondly, as far as black people are concerned, we did not come to these shores looking for freedom or anything else. We were kidnapped against our will, put into ships, and trafficked here. And if, by the grace of God, you survived the Middle Passage, our ancestors were then sold to the highest bidder, like a cow or a horse. And then, after being separated from our family or our kin, we were enslaved by white supremacist colonizers who became wealthy from black ingenuity and labor that went on for approximately 250 years. You know, so much money was made from the slavery that produced the U.S. economy that the South and the North fought a civil war. But the war didn't stop slavery. No, they just invented a different way to do it. So the white supremacists at the top came up with something called convict lease laws, where blacks were arrested for no reason, put in jail, and then they would be rented out to farmers or businesses for little or no money. Yet and still, many others of our ancestors who started successful businesses and communities out of jealousy were hung by their necks in public spectacles, or had their communities bombed or burned to the ground, and the citizens were murdered, just like in Tulsa, Oklahoma. So, my friends, if you look back over history and really see it for what it has been, any rational person would say it is we, people of color, who should be afraid of European whites. I mean, your children aren't being shot in the street. People of color didn't kidnap you and take you away and try to change your language or change your religion. But you want us to believe that you fear replacement? No, no. You're not afraid of replacement. You're afraid that you will reap what you have sown. You know, humans know deep inside that what you do will come back to you. So the fear that was put upon our African ancestors, the fear that was unleashed on the native and indigenous peoples of North America and on the Asians who came to this land. It seems to me that that guilt and fear is now chasing its master. The same fear that Iraqi mothers felt for their sons and daughters as bombs fell over Baghdad. The same fear that Palestinian parents feel for their families during Intifada. The fear that this government had put in the hearts of Ethiopians and Syrians and Libyan mothers because of the disrespect that has been demonstrated across the earth for over 400 years is now hunting and hunting you. The question becomes, how now do you deal with that fear? The question is the so-called fear of replacement really legitimate? Another question could be asked, is this so-called fear of replacement, which is a conspiracy theory we're being told that's coming from white supremacist groups, is that fear actually as broad as we're being made to believe it is? A question could also be, why is that topic, that issue, being made of significant importance in the news media rather than issues surrounding the importance of voting to be able to stop the establishment in this country of an autocratic apartheid government? Why is not the threat, the real threat of an autocratic apartheid white supremacist government being established in the United States, why is that not topic of discussion? Why are we being pointed toward replacement? I suggest that it's always important to ask the questions concerning what we see and hear. As old people used to say, consider the source. You're listening to the Thoughts for a Living podcast.